And on the biggest story tonight, we have some very special guests joining us just to break down the breaking news updates coming in from Ukraine and Russia in the last few hours. There are signs of a possible de-escalation. Whether it's actually translated into some de-escalation on the ground, we'll have to wait and watch. We'll go across to them, introducing Oleksiy Goncharenko, who's a Ukrainian MP and Vice Chairman of the Migration Committee. And I also have David Roger, who's a historian professor, joining us from Canada. Christopher Bobinski, who's a board member, Society of Journalists, joining us live from Poland, as Poland also braces for a possible situation unfolding. Margot Gontar is a founder of a project which tracks Russian troops' movement near Ukrainian border, and he's looking at the situation closely. He's also in Ukraine. My colleagues, Senior Executive Editor Abhishek Kapoor, Shravan Sen, also joining us on the show. Getting in a quick word from Shravan, he's in New Delhi. India is watching the situation closely. For all our viewers, there are over 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine. And this morning, there was an advisory asking students to leave Ukraine if they wanted to voluntarily. Let me get a word from Shravan, and I'll go across to our panelists. Shravan, to you first.
Well, in fact, there are two kind of responses that have really come in on this entire matter. One from the West, where you've already heard what the press secretary of the White House had to say earlier in the day, where they're now saying that while there is no date that can be attached as to when exactly Russia would invade, but they are saying that an invasion is still imminent. And this entire troop withdrawal could just be a hogwash. Now, that's what the West essentially looks at this point in time. As far as India is concerned, remember, India has been very cautious in their response so far. While there would be, some warmongering that is actually taking place, India, on the contrary, has essentially put out a message that as far as their consular services are concerned in Ukraine, that is still going to continue. And those Indians who are there right now in Ukraine, over 20,000, mostly students. In fact, we had few students joining us in the earlier broadcast. They are essentially indicating at this point in time that if anyone wants to come back, they can do so, but that's a temporary arrangement. So these are the two kind of responses. India, on the one hand, is essentially trying to ensure that there is no fear-mongering that takes place, and they are closely monitoring the situation on the ground. But a lot still needs to be done as far as whether at all there is a need for evacuating Indians from there at this point in time.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Shravan. Before I go across to Abhishek, getting in some more breaking news updates now, that Russia has, a few leaders in Russia backing a resolution calling for diplomatic recognition of eastern Ukraine's pro-Russian Donbas People's Republics, raising tensions between Russia and Ukraine another notch. That's another breaking news update coming in. The Russian parliament's motion calling for Vladimir Putin to formally recognize Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, both of which have been declared independent from Ukraine in 2014. Now, putting the story in perspective, let me go across and get in our special panelists joining us. First up, Oleksiy Goncharenko, who's a Ukrainian parliamentarian and a vice chairman of the Migration Committee. Let me go across to him. Oleksiy, Ukraine not convinced that the situation has de-escalated yet. What's your reading?
We see that Putin is blackmailing all the world with the war with Ukraine and eventually the Third World War. So we saw the situation for the second time during last year. I think and I believe that this is blackmailing. And now Putin received no for his absolutely crazy things that he wanted just for NATO to say that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, other countries. So Russia is not the country which should decide for others what to do. And I think that there will be no big invasion in Ukraine from Russian army now. And what is done by Putin's regime in Russian Federation now, they try to show that they are making some steps in recognizing of so-called republics. There are no republics. There are terroristic organizations, pro-Russian and Russian puppets there. And they are making a new act of aggression against Ukraine, recognizing these territories as being independent from Ukraine. But it is definitely Ukrainian sovereign territory. India and all other countries of the world recognized it as Ukrainian territory. And certainly there is nothing common between the decision of Russian parliament and the international law.
Interesting choice of words. You're a sitting parliamentarian, and you say that Putin is a crazy guy and capable of doing, something crazy. Now, let me get in a word also from Margot Gontar, who's tracking Russian troops and their movement. That's his full-time job. He's somewhere in Ukraine. Now, Margot, what is the truth about the mobilization on the borders? Russia claims that their troops who are part of the exercises with Belarus have pulled back. They're going back to their permanent bases. Now, that's one part of it. But has that changed along the border or just around Belarus?
Thank you for your question and for inviting. And actually, the latest data that we follow in is that analytics who also, like us, look on what's happening on the border. They say that no, they don't see less troops, and they actually see troops continue to come to Ukraine's border. And we have, numbers of video uploaded online from witnesses who see that. So yes, they did say that, but no, we don't see less troops on the border with Ukraine right now.
So you're saying there are no troops on the border with Ukraine?
Once again?
So you're saying, if I heard you correctly, you're saying there are no troops on the border with Ukraine now. You're seeing a reduction. Did I hear you correctly?
No. Sorry, that might be a problem with connection. No, I'm saying that troops are still there. They are Russian troops. They are not going from the border. Just the Russian side is stating that as a fact, but we see no evidence, and we see evidence of coming of more troops to Ukraine's border. So they are still there, and the latest numbers that were mentioned, including the UK officials, they were stating 130,000 of troops on the border, together with ground forces and Navy and other potential forces. But that could be more because it might be hard to calculate.
Okay, yeah, I think that's what Ukraine has suspected. Maybe it's one part of the border. But let me quickly toss to my colleague Abhishek, who's our senior executive editor, also joining us on the broadcast. He's an expert in diplomatic affairs here in Republic. He's our in-house expert. Abhishek, I'm coming to you, and you can take a question with Christopher Bobinski joining us from Poland and David Roger joining us live from Canada. And I think, Abhishek, one question that comes to our mind is if the West overplayed this entire episode. Abhishek.
Well, even now, in fact, you're there, just there, Niranjan. The fact that this statement of some Russian troop withdrawal is attributed to Defense Ministry of Russia, even that is not accepted, and NATO comes out with a statement that they are not seeing any evidence on the ground. So, obviously, there has been a game of as much as brinkmanship, there has been one-upmanship also going on. Remember, as we speak, the two leaders, the German Chancellor and Russian President, have been in talks for a while now in Moscow. So it's not that diplomacy has been just let go of from both the sides. In fact, Germans have been restrained to the extent that they have refused to supply weapons to Ukraine. France has been, for the entire period of standoff, the voice of reason in terms of not wanting to escalate things. The Western Europe has its reasons to stand by Ukraine in terms of the ideological divide that brings them together, the divide that Ukraine has with Russia on the issue of democracy and similar ideas. But then the fact is that any war is going to have economic consequences also. We cannot forget, or Europeans at least don't forget, that as much as 40% of energy requirements of West Europe today come from Russians. And other minerals, resources, including stuff like wheat. So there is a symbiotic relationship existing beyond this ideological sticking point. So I think Europe would need to find a modus vivendi to deal with the situation. I think Russia also has made a point by amassing all those troops at its border with Ukraine, and has underscored the fact that for them the red line is that Ukraine should not be made a member of NATO. if that red line is adhered to, at least for the time being, to defuse the situation, I think those talks must be going on. And if by withdrawing couple of units from the borders, Russians have sent a message to their German interlocutor while he is in Moscow that they are willing to go the halfway house, I think on the messaging front at least, even the Russians, as much as French, have been very reasonable. I think it's just a matter of time before reason prevails. But then, as I said, I've been maintaining, some trigger-happy guy on the ground can really take the situation out of hand, and that's something which both sides should be watchful about. Niranjan.
Abhishek, yeah, on that note, let me get in David Roger. David Roger, do you still believe invasion is a real threat?
It's a threat. I don't personally think it's a very likely thing that will happen. There could be some small incursion, but at the moment I would say Russia's got a lot of weaponry in place. In terms of the size of its army, 130,000 troops seems to be the most reliable figure that I've seen. That's not enough to occupy all of Ukraine. It's enough, perhaps, to make incursions into Ukraine. So my view is that what Russia is doing is putting pressure on Ukraine, but using international forums to justify what are really fairly outrageous demands. Russia knows, I think, that there would be no chance of NATO making some kind of blanket statement that Ukraine can never join. It's not up to Russia who becomes a member of NATO. And I think the real goal of Vladimir Putin is to undermine the security of Ukraine. And that has been the case from the beginning. Russia has occupied already Crimea back in 2014. It fomented a war in the Donbass, the breakaway regions you talked about earlier. And it's now posing a threat to the stability of the rest of Ukraine. That is my view. So in other words, what is happening on the ground is a means of pressure. It doesn't mean that World War III is about to break out, but Putin has already succeeded in stirring up a lot of fear in the Western media and among Americans, Canadians, and certainly at the level of the US president. So that is my feeling that Putin is doing, and he's quite successful at doing that, but it should be recognized what he's actually doing. If the Russian parliament has declared that it will recognize Donbass and Luhansk, Donetsk republics, so-called, that means that Vladimir Putin has asked them to do it. He has complete control over the Russian parliament. But if he does that, he violates the Minsk Accords that ended the Donbass full-scale warfare back in 2015. Would he do that? I don't know, because that would undermine the whole process and more solutions would have to be found. So that is my opinion, that the pressure is coming from Russia, but it's focused on undermining the Ukrainian government first and foremost, despite what is actually stated publicly.
Yes, agree with you there. Okay, let me get in a word from Christopher Babinski as well. Christopher, just before I come across to you, I just have a quick breaking news update from our newsrooms here. I'm going to play that out right now. There is a breaking news update. I'm reading from it. It's concerning Indian students, and it says here that in view of the uncertainties of the current situation in Ukraine, Indian nationals in Ukraine, particularly students whose stay is not essential, may consider leaving temporarily. Indian nationals are also advised to avoid all non-essential travel to and within Ukraine. Indian nationals are requested to keep the embassy informed about the status of their presence in Ukraine. And the big news point that's coming out of this is in the morning there was one missing mention. Now, a lot of people have been writing into our newsrooms asking for how they can get help from the Indian government. The government, that is the embassy here, has just released this official communication saying, for maintaining contact with Indian citizens in light of the situation, Embassy of India has opened the following special helplines and email ID. Urgent and emergency related queries must be directed only to these numbers. However, please note that given the deluge of phone calls and emails, Embassy may not be able to respond to all queries. Any new information will be regularly published on Embassy websites, Twitter, Facebook page. Contact numbers on your screen. So that's the contact number that the government of India, that's the embassy, the Indian embassy has just shared with all those students who had concerns, were wondering where they can get help from. In fact, many worried parents also spoke to Republic TV this afternoon, saying that they were wondering how they can bring their children back. But on that note, let me get in another, let me get in Christopher now. Christopher, you think, with the rhetoric now playing out, West and Ukraine saying that, Putin has been forced to de-escalate, and with Kremlin now saying that they've already won without a shot being fired, do you think there is a possibility this could have been rhetoric and each side ratcheting up the tensions with just rhetoric all along? Do the facts on the ground match?
My feeling is that Mr. Putin is playing a long game here. I think he really never came to terms with the fact that the Soviet Union is no longer there. He still looks at the map and he sees the map as it was in 1989. And he's now that he's been in charge for so many years, now he has to leave some kind of legacy behind him, and that legacy will be a message to his people that the limits of the country that he knew in 1989 have to be restored. Now, evidently, at this moment, he has decided that making a military incursion into Ukraine would be very, very costly. Economically, it would be costly in terms of influence around the world, et cetera, so that they've drawn back. But this isn't over. Pressure on Ukraine will be kept up. It may not be military pressure, but there will be political pressure, economic pressure, et cetera. And constantly he will be working to undermine the situation in the Ukraine. So hopefully at some point, people will rebel and maybe turn towards him. I think that may be his calculation. But remember, the costs are actually significant. Around the perimeter, Finland and Sweden, who have always said they don't want to be in NATO, are now talking about joining NATO. American troops have come back to Poland. We have about 3,000 American troops landing in Poland. This is something that hasn't been on the agenda for a long time. NATO will have to rethink its policy towards Russia to look at actually what's happening, and all these are costs which he has risked, we just have to watch it. I don't think there'll be trouble now, but this is by far not over at all.
Let's see where it goes. Tracking the story very closely from Odessa, Edmonton, Poland, and somewhere in Ukraine. Margot joining us. Thank you for joining us on the broadcast.